Okay, good afternoon. My clock says 11:59, so I think we'll get started. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar. I appreciate you joining us on what looks like a sunny day, at least here in Bismarck. Today we will be covering sort of a legislative wrap-up and next steps after this 2021 legislative session. I'm Alexis Baxley, Executive Director of the North Dakota School Boards Association. I will be leading the presentation today. We also have Amy Cook, our legal counsel on, and I think we have Rebecca, our policy services director on. So those ladies will maybe assist me throughout the day. Amy may be able to answer some questions. So please remember to put your questions in the Q&A spot. Amy and I will monitor that. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. I think that will be easiest. We won't monitor the chat as closely as the Q&A, so make sure you're putting those questions in the Q&A. With that, I will get started. Okay, so just some quick session stats. You've probably heard this from me before, but total bills introduced this legislative session were down by about 100. Interestingly enough, the bills that NDSBA was tracking was up. I think much of that can be attributed to COVID reactionary bills, whether they were vaccine bills, mask bills, things like that we don't typically see, but saw significantly more of. Election bills would be another thing that fell in that category. Legislature adjourned sine die just after midnight, so Thursday the 29th or Friday, April 30th. In doing so, they saved 4 legislative days, so they can call themselves back if they need to during the interim with those 4 days. As you know, we had virtual participation this legislative session. It made, I think, a significant difference in the experience. There were significantly less people in the Capitol all session long. We missed student tours, visitors, things like that. We had some legislators that I believe there was one who participated entirely remotely the full session. Most only used that remote option on occasion. We did hear from legislators that they received an incredible amount of testimony compared to normal years. Because of the ease of submitting written testimony, so many people took advantage of that option. We learned pretty quickly that they probably were not reading all of that testimony. So it was, as it always has been, very important to still head to the Capitol and present that testimony in person. I think that virtual participation will look a little bit different during the interim. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but legislators have already been sort of expressing a want to encourage in-person participation whenever possible. Okay, so the top issues that we had this 2021 legislative session. Funding and finance, of course, House bill. Oh, I see something in the chat. Okay, but I'm kind of muffled. Amy, can you hear me okay?
I can, but you are a little muffled.
How about this? Is this better?
It's a little bit better, yep.
Anyone in the chat want to tell me if they can hear me? Juan says yes. Okay, I'll keep going until somebody tells me otherwise. Okay, so House Bill 1388 was, of course, the per pupil payment increase bill. It was kind of the catch-all bill for education issues, but that was the largest thing that was in there. By now, you all know that that was a 1 and 1% increase. We had to fight pretty hard to get that 1 and 1% increase. A lot of gratitude to Senator Don Shively out of Mott for his work and leadership on that issue. The Senate really sort of stood strong despite opposition from the House and got that done for us. So, other things in that bill were adjustments to small school district size weighting factors, some authorization and details regarding virtual instruction, reading competency licensure requirements, We'll talk about those a little bit more later. A phase out timeline of transition maximum districts. You might recall we had that last session. We have adjusted that timeline, and then a funding study for K-12 education. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. We also had House Bill 1013, which you're all probably familiar with. That is, of course, the DPI appropriation budget, but also includes the per pupil appropriation that is defined in 1388. One other thing to note within that was a requirement to use an amount equal to at least 70% of all new money within that per pupil calculation to increase compensation paid to non-administrative personnel. So anybody in your building other than administrators. If you are one of the unfortunate districts who don't receive any new money, 70% of zero is zero. Other funding or finance bills, 1027, our transportation aid formula. Typically, we would have to battle that out as a line item in DPI's budget. We've now codified that formula so that hopefully that will be less of a battle each session. In 1015, there was a $70 million appropriation for CTE to do a Career Center Initiative grant program. Senate Bill 2165 removes the ending fund balance requirements until July 1 of 2023 and removes impact aid from the calculation of your from the calculation of your ending fund balance. So that was done to hopefully give you guys some more time to thoughtfully spend those ESSER dollars without holding that against you. You know, there's a large sums of money coming in. You don't want you to have to spend those. Yes. And then, of course, House Bill 1028. You might recall during COVID, we and NDCEL had worked with you to deal with that ending fund balance issue. A number of districts transferred funds from their general fund to their building fund in order to avoid that general ending balance issue. Typically, you could not return that money to the general fund for a number of years. In good faith, the legislature told us that that would be a good route. They'd make it right. They did. House Bill 1028 authorizes you to one time move that money back into your general fund. Can't just empty out your general fund if you didn't move that money this past spring or this past year. But if you did do that, you are able to make that one-time return transfer. It must be done by June 30th. We did just issue guidance on this and a sample resolution that went out last week. We sent it directly to the list of districts that we were aware had made this transfer. If you made a transfer like that and you did not get guidance, reach out to Amy or I and we'll make sure that you get it. We think our list is pretty exhaustive, but just make sure. Okay, the negotiations and employment bills. Of course, Senate Bill 2215, which was our negotiations timeline bill, that does not go into effect until August 1st, so it does not affect your current negotiations if you are doing so. Essentially, it sets a deadline of July 1 for the board and the teachers to come to an agreement. If that doesn't happen, the board and the teachers can mutually agree to keep negotiating, or impasse is automatically declared. House Bill 1349 deals with application confidentiality. If you are a district that hired a superintendent in the past 3 to 4 years, you know that those superintendent applications were confidential until you selected finalists to interview. They are no longer confidential. They are exempt, which means that you can keep them confidential if you get an open records request. You don't have to release them. But you can if you would like. It does also clarify that once applicants are selected as finalists, that information is public. I think most of our districts have treated it as such, but the code is a little clearer. Senate Bill 2332 creates or adds a special education teacher to the list of alternative teacher licenses allowed. You may recall from last session, the American Board came in, was able to create an alternative license for a number of their programs. It is that same program. Senate Bill 2332 also removed the sunset on that that passed bill on that section of code and required a study of the alternative teacher licenses. So we'll be talking about those more during the intro. Calendar, instructional time, and curriculum issues. House Bill 1232 and House Bill 1388, which I previously mentioned, included authorization for virtual instruction programs. So you may recall during COVID, we had to get an executive order from the governor to allow virtual instruction to count towards seat time so you could keep getting paid. This codifies that, lays out some framework for how it will work, and then requires administrative rule writing to really firm up how that's going to work. So that 1232 and 1388, we'll talk again more about later. 1478, dubbed the Learn Everywhere bill, essentially creates a internship or experience credit, allows those credits to count for other required credits, requires the board to adopt a policy if you wish to partake in the program. Senate Bill 2147, a GED credit, allows a district again to adopt a policy to allow successful completion of portions of the GED to count towards graduation requirement or math, English credits, etc. I think the goal of the bill was to really help districts catch those students that have done the bulk of the work and through life circumstances find themselves potentially not graduating or on the verge of not graduating when they're very close. Senate Bill 2196, the competency framework bill. 2304, Native American curriculum. Essentially, the way 2304 ended was by placing an emphasis on Native American history, North Dakota tribes, on U.S. history and on the U.S. history and North Dakota studies requirements that are already in code. Your Native American Essential Understandings program that DPI has put out in recent years meets those requirements. We do have a couple other groups in the state that are, I believe, are creating curriculum that they'll probably shop to school districts. But the law does not say you have to use their curriculum, this curriculum, or that curriculum. It just wants to emphasize that your U.S. history programs and your North Dakota study programs include that emphasis on Native American history and North Dakota tribes. And then 1356, outside access or Boy Scout access, requires school districts to give Boy Scouts or other youth patriotic societies access to students during the school day. We will likely be releasing some sort of guidance or policy update. I'm not quite sure what it would look like on this. We believe there are some potential issues and risks with this guaranteed access. So stay tuned for that. Okay, school board authority and liability. Senate Bill 2308, the 10 Commandments bill, of course, authorizes boards to post the 10 Commandments as part of a grouping of religious or historical displays. We will likely be issuing guidance on this as well. I want to caution you here loudly and often. This is a tough thing to do and get right and not end up in trouble. So I would encourage you, if this is something your district decides they want to do, to immediately contact your legal counsel and get some advice on how you're going to do that. House Bill 1337 allows a dissolving district to transfer property to another political subdivision. This one's a little niche, gets a little complicated, but essentially if you are a school district that is dissolving, you have the ability, after some criteria are met, to transfer your property to the city or the county, etc. Senate Bill 2278 removes or makes boards and school districts, their employees, immune from potential COVID-19 related liability. So this bill kind of had a sister bill for the business community. This was the one that took care of schools. Amy, do you see any questions yet?
None yet. Nope.
Okay, elections and meetings issues. House Bill 1253 This is the election administration bill. I don't know how many pages the darn thing ended up being, but it was one of the last bills out and probably one of the longest. It includes all sorts of changes to North Dakota election laws. Most don't require to don't apply to school districts, excuse me. They apply to cities, counties, and the state, but there are a number of things in it that do apply to school districts. NDSBA recently published an elections guide. We are updating it to include 1253. I don't want to send it out to all of you and have it be current for a month, and then on August 1st, when all of these things go into effect, have to redo it. So watch for that after August 1st. We should have that guide ready to go for your next election cycle. These changes, of course, do not apply to the cycle that you just went through or are about to wrap up. And then House Bill 1349, electronic meetings. That makes clear that political subdivisions, school districts are allowed to provide public access through electronic means, allows you to meet electronically only. And I didn't really know what to call this category, so we're just calling it children or kids. Maybe it should have been my other category, but Senate Bill 2083 is a long Department of Human Services bill, but essentially establishes that institutional child neglect exists. Institutional, of course, would apply to a K-12 setting, and then lays out investigation procedures, contacts, things like that. It's something that hopefully will not affect districts regularly, but could. Amy does plan on writing her legal spotlight article in the bulletin on that issue in July. So,
Alexis, before we move on,
yeah,
Robin from Fargo made a really good point, just to mention on the last slide about the electronic meetings. Just to note that we did write an article on that in the bulletin last month,
yep.
And sent a quick correction because in the wee hours of the legislative session, they added an emergency clause to the electronic meetings section in House Bill 1349. So basically what that means is that boards, school boards, and other public entities are allowed to hold meetings electronically without having to provide that public access in the physical location. So thank you for that, Robin, for reminding us on that.
Yeah, that's a great add. That is in effect. Okay. And then House Bill 1416 and House Bill 1466. I'm not sure how closely everybody paid attention to this. I know some of you did. This involves early childhood education, licensure and programs, and then program grants. I'm expecting DHS to do some administrative rule writing on these topics. That may provide some clarity on these issues in the interim. Okay, so obviously I didn't hit every bill that was passed. We have an hour today and I want to save time for questions. So I tried to hit the big ones. If I missed something that you want to talk about by the end, please feel free to ask. I do want to make sure that you know we are working here in the office. Amy and Rebecca have been reviewing all of the legislation that was passed, trying to identify where we may need to write new policy templates to make available or update current policies. These are some that we have identified that are likely. They're of course not all new policies. They may just be updates to current policies. Okay, and I always am a firm believer that the bills you kill have far more effect on you than the bills that you pass. It's often pretty hard to kill a bill. I think Amy and I probably spend twice as much time trying to kill bad bills or mediocre bills as we do trying to pass good bills. So you might remember in the beginning, I said we were tracking about 170 bills. More than 100 of those either died or were withdrawn, so they did not become law. That included a couple of bills that would have created vouchers or tax credits for private or homeschool kids, limitations on school board taxing authority, reductions on or elimination of property taxes altogether, The transgender athlete bill, partisan elections, that bill would have required you to declare if you were a Republican, Democrat, Green Party, Libertarian, whatever you wanted, candidate in a school board election. A seclusion and restraint bill, a number of weapons bills, of course, the PERS bill. Got quite a few questions on this towards the end of session. The PERS program is in tough shape. They were looking at increases in contributions by political subdivisions. They were looking at turning it into a defined benefit plan. Excuse me, a defined contribution plan instead of a defined benefit plan. Ultimately, those bills all failed, and there are no changes to the PERS system right now. There is a study, and we'll talk about that later. The patriotism project, it essentially would have been extra curriculum, more projects. The referral of your preliminary budget to voters every July, and then various bills dealing with immunization requirements, immunization prohibitions. I think every approach to the topic was on the table. So these are just a number of the topics that we saw dead bills on. But really, this I think is the bulk of the work that we do. And you can look at that list of topics and go, oh cow, if those things would pass, we'd be in pretty tough shape. So I always want to make sure everybody knows the yucky things that are out there. And then of course, but what about masks, right? Man, Amy and I probably got more mask questions than anything else. House Bill 1323 did pass. It was vetoed, and then the veto was overrode by both the House and the Senate, so it did become a law. I believe in the Senate, school boards and local political subdivisions were struck from the bill. So at the end of the day, the final version of the bill prohibits the governor, state agencies, and the state health officer from implementing a mask mandate, but does not prohibit local political subdivisions from doing that. Hopefully we won't ever have to have this question or this discussion again, but for now, political subdivisions still have that authority. Okay, so if those were the new laws and the dead bills, what's next? Of course, we have the 2021-22 interim, which includes quite a bit of work to get ready for the next session. So the first thing we're going to focus on is administrative rule writing. Four topics here: the Learn Everywhere bill, virtual learning in 1232 and 1388, the creation of a dyslexia specialist credential in 1131, and then reading curriculum and teacher professional learning in 1388. Those four rule writing committees are either scheduled to start or have started already. You can see there, Amy or I are representing NDSBA on those committees. NDCEL also has representation on, I believe, all of those committees, at least 3 of them, if not all 4. And essentially, we will work through that administrative rule writing process. You may remember that Learn Everywhere and virtual learning were on my policy update side. Don't expect those policies until we've completed this rule writing process. We cannot draft a policy until the rules are finalized. So what is that process, right? First, of course, the legislature has to give authority to the appropriate agency to draft rules. That, of course, has happened. That happens in those bills. Right now, we're working on the committee drafting rules. I think most of the committees meet 3 or 4 times, have various stakeholders represented, eventually come up with their final draft of the rules, at which point a public comment period opens. None of those comment periods have opened yet. We will notify you when they do. If you have feedback on any of those issues, please let Amy or I know. We'd love to have your feedback as we help draft those rules. You can share it with us now, or you can wait until the public comment period. I would encourage you, if you feel strongly about something, to share it with us now. It's easier to work changes in now than it is after that public comment period. So once the public comment period is closed, the public hearing will be held. This is your opportunity. If sending a letter with your comments isn't enough, you want to stand up and tell the committee about it in person. you can do that. That is a public hearing. They're posted. The public is allowed to attend and to come. After the public hearing, there is the opportunity for revisions to be made to the rules. It's not often that too many revisions are made. Most of them are minor or technical things that got missed in the drafting. I have not seen, at least in my time, at least in education-related rules, too many significant changes. So again, that's why I say if you have feedback, share it now with Amy and I. It's easier to try to incorporate that while the committee is drafting. So once the revisions are complete or they opt not to be made, the rules go to the Administrative Rules Committee of the Legislature for final approval. This is kind of what sets the timeline for the rules being implemented. The next time that Administrative Rules Committee meets will be December. So for all 4 of the committees that Amy and I are on, the goal is to complete this process by December so that we can get those things approved and get them implemented in the new year. So I would say as of right now, that's when you could expect those policies is early on in 2022. That timeline could change. It's very rare that the Administrative Rules Committee doesn't approve rules, but they have sent rules back for further work if they believe they go outside of the authority they're granted. So tentatively expect that to be ready to go in 2022, but it could change. What else? Interim studies. So legislative management met late in May and then again, I believe last week, to select which studies that they were going to do. They selected 50 studies. Of those 50, NDSBA is following 19 of them. Not all of them are significant or education-related studies, but many of them do have some connection or effect on school districts. So interim studies and interim committees can, of course, result in legislation that we see in 2023, but don't have to. Sometimes turning a bill into a study is just a polite way of killing it. Some of those studies don't get chosen, but some of them still do. If an interim committee wishes to create legislation, those bills are required to be read at least 2 meetings of the interim committee. Typically, those committees wrap up their work in October, November of the year prior to the legislative session. So for this interim, we would say October or November of 2022. So it's really about a year and a half you get, not quite, to work through some of these issues. And it sounds like a lot of time when you're fresh off a legislative session and it feels like forever until the next one. But it goes really quickly and you would be surprised how often we feel like we need more meetings at the end of the cycle to get some of those things done. So you can, of course, learn more about the interim committees and the studies that were selected on the legislative webpage. It is essentially the same webpage you would have went to all session to get information. Instead of choosing regular session, you select session interim. That is a direct link on the side. So the key studies for NDSBA that were selected are a competency-based learning study. They're essentially going to review the districts that have an innovation waiver or doing other innovative things. That was created in House Bill 1111. K-12 funding, which we talked about before in House Bill 1388. That alternative teacher licensure study that we discussed. Compulsory school attendance in 3009, statutes governing CTE, including the impact of CTE student transportation. That study was created in House Resolution 3035. Of course, what we talked about earlier, the study of the PERS, Public Employee Retirement System, that is in House Bill 1209. I think that will be a big study that you will get to read about in the newspaper lots of times over the course of the interim. I can't begin to predict what will come of that, other than to say the current system will not work soon. I expect there to be changes of some sort. They're likely going to cost school districts money at some point. The question is just how much and when. And then, of course, there are a couple of juvenile justice studies through Senate Bill 2258 and 1306. Many of those have connections to school districts in how we handle some of those discipline issues and when we hand those kids over if necessary. And then legislative redistricting in House Bill 1397. We are, of course, in a census year. So that means every 10 years, the legislature redistricts itself. Sometimes there are lots of changes, sometimes there are not very many. This legislative redistricting committee will work to come up with a plan on how to do that and outline, define some boundaries. And then the legislature will have to come together to approve that. So a couple of these interim committees to be aware of. Your education policy committee, you can see the members there that can
It looks like we may have, Alexis might be frozen. If you want to just give us a couple of minutes here. Oh, okay. So Alexis is gonna switch out with me. Her computer just died. So give us 2 seconds here to switch.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not sure what happened other than I'm working on a desktop plugged into the wall and it all went blank all of a sudden. So Amy's working to see if we can get the slides back up. I may be able to do that from here. But as I mentioned, that education policy committee has quite a few members. Many of them serve on the House or Senate education committees during this session, so have a good idea of what's going on, what's been discussed, the intent behind these studies, but not all of them. It's pretty common for these interim committees to spend a meeting or two getting members up to speed. So I think with a committee that size, we can expect to see that happen somewhat. Okay, let's see if I can get... I apologize here, you guys. Oh. Okay. And I suppose I can't do that. Okay, I'm working without slides here, I guess. I really apologize. We are still recording. I see one comment on restarting the recording. We record through YouTube, so it looks like we are still good to go there. The next slide would have been to show you the Education Funding Committee. Amy's working on getting me slides here. Would have been that Education Funding Committee. That committee will be chaired by Senator Don Shibley. Of course, he is the Senate Education Chairman, or was this past session. It will be vice chaired by the House Education Committee Chairman, Mark Owens of Grand Forks. They will take up 1388 and the CTE funding study. Okay. Other studies, another committee would be that retirement system study. They did dedicate a whole new committee to House Bill 1209, the PERS study. That committee has probably 15 to 20 members. It is chaired by Representative Mike LaFour. I think that study, as I said, that committee will meet quite regularly. They will maybe have more meetings than most. I will be interested to see how much data, who they bring in to provide extra information. Okay, still hoping for slides here, you guys. Nothing yet. Okay. Let's see. I apologize. This is tough to do without slides, and I just put most of those slides together. So what's next after those interim studies? Nope, thought I was going to have them. How about let's do some questions while we see if we can get those slides. Does anybody have questions on bills that I mentioned or did not mention that you were hoping I would discuss? No questions. Let's check the chat. Nothing there either. Okay, so I do want to make sure that everybody is also aware how they can participate in the interim. Please, of course, watch your NDSBA bulletin. We will include important updates there, emails, possibly further future lunch and learns. But most importantly, if there is something that you really significantly care about, follow the interim committees. If you visit that webpage that I linked earlier, all of the information about the studies, the committee members, they post their meetings there, they post their agendas there, they post the minutes there, are all available. I do expect that we will be able to watch the interim committees remotely as you did during the session. I kind of touched on before how legislators seem to be encouraging in-person participation. That was a large part of legislative management's discussion last week. They want to ensure that legislators are attending in person whenever possible. They approved some rules for themselves to limit remote participation only at the approval of the chair. So I think that most will be there in person, which really makes for a better discussion, but we will still be able to watch remotely if you wish. So typically those meetings are posted at least 2 to 3 weeks in advance. So again, if you are tracking something, maybe it's the PERS committee, check that website early every month and you should be able to hit those meeting notices and get them on their calendar. Other ways to participate during the interim is the NDSBA Government Affairs Committee. So I put together a committee every July. I'll start soliciting applications next month. And that committee reviews the policies and resolutions that really guide NDSBA's legislative advocacy at every session. It's a great way to kind of start your involvement in those legislative issues and get up to speed on what we're working on as NDSBA, what else is out there. The requirements for that committee is 1 to 2 phone call meetings. We work through those policies and resolutions and put them forth towards the delegate assembly. And then of course, the next option is NDSBA's legislative committee. We obviously won't convene that committee again until a month or 2 before the next legislative session, but quite often my legislative committee members are former government affairs committee members. So it's helpful for Amy and I to have feedback from those committee members throughout the session, but it's helpful if those committee committee members have been able to be looped in on some of these issues prior to right before the session. So if you're somebody that's really interested in those legislative issues, wants to be more involved, I think that's a great way to start. Oh, I think we might be getting some slides here. Not yet. Okay. Hey, there we go. All right. Thank you, Amy. We are back in business. As we talked before, Education Policy Committee, quite a few members that have served on education, a number that haven't. If you take a look at this and recognize senators or representatives that are part of your district, I encourage you to reach out to them, open that line of communication. Legislators were very grateful and expressed certainly more frequently this legislative session appreciation for hearing from their local officials. So I think most of these legislators would be happy to know that those lines of communication are open. They're looking for your experience and your expertise. Be sure to know how to get a hold of them if these guys are your representatives. So again, Education Policy Committee studies House Bill 1111, 2332, and 3009. Next slide, Amy. The Retirement Committee that we talked about, chaired by Mike LaFour. Again, you can see 14 members. Their only study is 1209, the PERS retirement system. This is an interesting committee. It has some representation from the committee that worked on the PERS issues during the session. It has some others. It's an interesting balance of Republicans, Democrats, and what we kind of call Bastiats that are the far right Republicans. It will be interesting to see the results of their work. Amy, next one. Okay, so we talked about redistricting previously. That will be based somewhat on census data. That likely means that rural districts might get smaller and we could see new urban districts. The legislature right now has 47 districts. I believe they are allowed constitutionally to have up to 53. In the past 20 years, I think we've had as many as 49. From what I have heard from legislators, they're not super excited to add new districts. Each new district adds about $1 million per biennium to the cost of running government. So I think they will try to work that 47 number if at all possible. Like I said, that redistricting committee will come up with the initial plan in late November or early December. The legislature will convene their whole body to debate and approve that redistricting plan. Special session ? So I mentioned earlier that we saved 4 days. Initially, the goal was to save 10 days so that there were days to use for redistricting and days to use if more federal COVID funds came available, other legislative issues popped up. Sort of word on the street, I guess I would say, is that the plan at this point is for the governor to call the legislature back for redistricting. If the governor convenes the legislature, they do not have to use the days that are allotted to them constitutionally. If they call themselves back, they do have to use those days. So I believe they're hoping the governor will call them back to redistrict so that they can continue to save those 4 days if necessary. It's usually pretty uncommon to have a special session. They like to save days just in case, but I think it's more likely to happen if future federal funds come in and the legislature will want to have input on how to spend those. So we could see this where we usually don't. So next slide, Amy. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this when I didn't have slides. Amy, if you want to advance again, how do you participate? That legislative committee that I mentioned, that is the biggest way to participate. These were our 2021 legislative members. Thank you to them for all of their input and help. It really makes a difference for Amy and I to have their weekly participation and on the ground knowledge as we work through the issues. Next, Amy. Government Affairs Committee that I mentioned, as I said, we'll begin soliciting applications for that in July. That's kind of a great starting point to then end up on that legislative committee. We will review our resolutions that are up for renewal. We'll also review any new resolutions that are submitted by school districts or the NDSBA Board of Directors. I will likely put an announcement in the bulletin that we're accepting applications for that. So watch there if you're interested. Amy. Okay, and of course, stay in the know, right? Like I said, NDSBA bulletin, emails, webinars. We will likely have a couple of legislative clinic sessions at our convention in October. We'll provide an opportunity for you to hear from some legislators there. Follow those interim committees online and reach out to your legislators, whether they are a member of those committees that I highlighted or not. It is so much easier during the legislative session when we have an issue for me to call and say, hey, Robin, I really need you to reach out to this Fargo legislator. Sorry, I'm picking on Robin today, but and Robin already has that relationship built. It's an easy phone call. So I really encourage you to connect with your legislators now in the interim, start that discussion so that they can rely on you come legislative session. Amy, next. Okay. So that is what I have. I apologize for our technical difficulties today. That was rough. Are there any questions? I know that there were a number of bills that I left out and details that I didn't dive into. I want to be able to answer your questions or have Amy answer your questions. Now is the time. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, you see Amy and I, we see Amy and I's contact information there on the slide. I will post the slides so you have them all in order. Please call me if I confused anybody with our technical difficulties today. We're always here, happy to help and answer questions. So with that, thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.